Well, good morning. It's good to see you today. I know Pastor Corey already shared this, but I was just so proud of you as a church. You gave, you came, you packed, and now you're sending enough things to help 1,600 people last week. And that was just incredible. Yeah, you can applaud that. That's fantastic. So proud of you. So excited to be part of a church that loves their community and loves their neighbors like that. So thank you so much for doing that. And we're going to continue with our global impact theme and series called Flip the Switch here in just a moment. But in 2 weeks from today, we're starting a brand new series, December 6th, called Simple Christmas. And I know you might think, well, wait a minute, Pastor Corey just talked about an event called Simple Christmas. Which is it? It's both. The series we're going to take on in December is all about the fact that for most of us, a simple, Christ-centered Christmas makes a lot of sense this year. I mean, it makes sense every year, but especially all the things that have been going on. And so we're going to spend all of December talking about Simple Christmas, and we're going to kick it off with not only the message that day, but the event that night. So I hope that you'll set aside time on December 6th to join us online or in person, and then do the drive-through event, or if you're willing and able, you can come and do it as a little bit of a come-and-go thing that night. But either way, get ready for a great December, and I'm looking forward to it. It's going to be a fantastic time for our church family. Like I said, we are finishing up Global Impact today, and I came across a statement, and as soon as I read it, I thought, I see that all the time, but then it finally clicked with me, and so I want to share it with you. It's a simple statement. It comes from the world of investing, okay? And so even if you're not a big financial person, that's okay. You're going to probably recognize this, and it's very simple. It just says that past results do not guarantee future performance, right? I mean, it's pretty simple. It's pretty straightforward. And in essence, you usually hear it when you talk about mutual funds and things like that. But the idea is, and what they're trying to do is kind of cover themselves and just say, hey, just because this investment has been really good in the past, it doesn't mean it's going to continue to be good. There's a risk there. But what do? I mean, if you do any kind of investing at all, if you've got a retirement plan going or anything like that, you look and see, well, how has it done in the past? And if it's done pretty well, you kind of like, hey, there's no guarantees. I'm willing. I'm going to do it, because the truth is, while the past doesn't guarantee future results, it's usually a pretty good indicator, right? And it actually works in your life quite a bit. You do this all the time, even if you don't know about it. I mean, the things you have learned from your past tell you a lot about how you're going to live your life. And so let me give you a couple of do's and do nots that you've probably zeroed in on at some point in your life. Some of them are very, very simple. They're so common. It's don't quit. Right? You hear that all the time. Hey, don't quit. Keep going. You're right on the edge of a breakthrough. Don't quit. Then the other side of that is you need to know when to quit, right? You need to know when to stop. There is a point, especially as parents, you're like, nope, it's time to quit. We're done here. We've done this enough. It's time to quit. You need to know when to quit, and you need to not quit. It also turns out that your mom was right. It's very important how you pick your friends, right? I mean, most of us have learned that eventually over time. We realize, hey, you know what? She was actually right. The people that I spend my life with have a pretty big impact on me, and I need to pick the right friends. I was kind of looking online. I wanted to see where there's some other sayings, other common kind of lessons we've learned from the past. And I read this one, and it was basically broken down into 3 parts. And the first 2 parts, I was like, yeah, that makes sense. The third part kind of creeped me out a little bit. But basically, it's pretty straightforward. It said that you will survive this. Right? Okay, so whatever you're going through, whatever's going on, I know it seems like the end of the world. I know it seems like everything's out of control. You will survive this. And I thought, okay, that makes sense. That's good. That's encouraging. Then the next part said, don't sweat the petty things. And I'm like, well, yeah, that makes sense too. You can't get all worked up just because something happens. Then the last part just kind of creeped me out. It said, don't pet the sweaty things, which I'm kind of like, what are the sweaty things, and who learned from experience not to pet them, and why did this make it on the internet? But anyway, my personal favorite, I used to be a finance major, so my personal favorite is actually a financial one. And it's very simple. It says, don't borrow money, but if you do, borrow from a pessimist. They don't expect you to pay them back. So there you go. That's my big funny joke for the day. All right. The point is, we learn from the past, don't we? Things happen, and we learn what to do and what not to do because of what happened in the past. And that's actually a really good thing. And it's actually never been more important than when the future's not clear. When you're a little concerned about the future, when you feel like maybe it's more out of control than usual, when you're kind of looking at 2021 and going, I think it's going to be better. I hope it's going to be better. But I don't feel comfortable saying it's for sure going to be better. It's a little murky. It's a little unsure. That just means so much more that we have to rely on what we've learned from the past. So when you take that simple idea of learning from the past and you combine it with what I call the rule of do, we're going to talk about in just a few minutes. But if you combine those 2 things, it actually gives you a lot more control over the future than you think you have. learning from the past and the rule of do can actually change what happens in your life. And so as we get into this, what I want to do is I want to share with you an example of learning from the past that I think speaks incredibly well to what we're dealing with today, okay? So the person that we're going to look at, his name is Paul, and he was an interesting guy. Paul was a passionate guy. He was the guy that would always be speaking the loudest and being the most extreme, and I mean, he was just an all-in kind of guy. By AD 34, Paul had decided that people that followed Jesus were the enemy. And so he was literally having them arrested. He was dragging them out of their homes. He would put them in prison. And while it's not specifically said, it's not too far of a reach to think he was also torturing people and he also had people executed. I mean, this guy was extreme. And he has an experience. He's traveling to a city called Damascus, and on the way, he has an encounter with Christ, and it changes his life. It changes his life so dramatically that he goes from somebody who was persecuting followers of Jesus to becoming a follower of Jesus. He goes from somebody that used to hunt them down in other towns to starting churches in other towns. I mean, this is a complete switch that happened in his life. But there's a little bit of a problem. You see, everybody that knew Paul knew him as the guy that dragged people away, had them arrested, had them tortured, and even had some of them killed. And so even though Paul was claiming to be a Christian, a lot of them were like, okay, that's good for you, but you stay over there. I don't trust you. I don't know who you are, what you're about. I mean, if you are going to be a follower of Jesus, that's fantastic, but I can't afford to trust you. The risk is too great. And here's what happens. Paul goes dark. He disappears. Now, he didn't, he moved away, but we don't hear from Paul again until AD 46. So almost 12 years later, before you even hear his name again. Because people don't trust him. They don't know what he's about. They don't know, is this real? Is this not real? In the meantime, during those 12 years that we know nothing about Paul's life, the persecution of the church kind of ratcheted up. And it got so intense that the church that was largely based in Jerusalem, that was meeting in the temple, was forced out. And they literally had to go on the run. And they spread out everywhere. They ran to all these different towns and villages and places all around. And I mean, this is hard for us to get a hold of. What would it take to force you to leave your home? And not just leave your home temporarily. Leave your home for good. I mean, we can't really compare to this, but that's kind of the context that these people were living in. They were under such threat and such danger. The only real option they had was to take what they could carry and leave and move. And probably never come back. And that's exactly what happened. Because even though Paul stopped persecuting the church, there were a lot of people just like Paul that took his place. And we find Paul turning up, like I said, in about AD 46 in a little town called Antioch. And in Antioch, Paul came and he found some believers. Now, they didn't have a church building. They didn't have anywhere to meet. And they had been kicked out of Jerusalem. They kind of had to go on the run. And he begins to invest his life there. He begins to love these people, develop relationships with these people. They're sharing with each other about who Jesus is, and they're beginning to build a church, even though they have no building and they're not meeting anywhere, and they're beginning to build a church, and things are going well until about a year into this. About a year into this, somebody stands up and he says, a famine's coming. Now, again, for us, we hear the word famine and we're kind of like, If you lived in the ancient times, a famine meant two things: a lot of pain and death. Those were the two things that were going to happen with a famine. And not only is a famine coming, he says it is empire-wide. There's no place to go. You can't go north a couple 100 miles and everything is fine. This is the whole Roman Empire. For them, this is the whole world. And here's where it kind of gets crazy. Now, think about this. You got a church that can't meet in their building anymore in the middle of a national and international crisis going on where people are dying. Does this sound familiar to anybody? We can learn from the past, right? There's things that were happening to them that seem different and remote from us, but it's actually very, very similar to what's happening to us. In this little church in Antioch, where Paul is, and he's watching all of this play out in front of him. They've had to go there because they had to run there. They were refugees. They started a church and things were going well, and now a famine comes. And I'm sure their feeling was, man, I just left my home. I just left everything I've ever known. We ran to this place. We're trying to carve out and scratch out a life here. And now we find out that basically suffering and death is on its way, and there's nowhere to go. And you could imagine some of the questions they might start asking themselves, did we make a mistake somewhere? Is this the way things are supposed to be? Is God judging us? Is God judging the Romans? Does this mean Jesus is coming back? Is this the end of the world? And I'm sure they asked some of those questions. But the question they asked most, the overwhelming question they kept coming back to time and time again, is one that just blows my mind. It's kind of a fantastic question. I mean, there's no reason for them to ask this question. But in the middle of an international crisis, of having no place to meet, no building, and being on the run, they ask this question: how can we help? How can we help? We have no church. We've been kicked out of our building. We're refugees, and a famine's on our way. How can we help? What can we do? Where can we step into this? And Paul watched all of this play out. You can read all about it in Acts chapter 11 if you want to. We're not going to go there this morning, but if you want to read about the story, it's in Acts chapter 11. This little church eventually gathers resources, financial resources, who they didn't have much to start with, and they sent an offering to help the people in Jerusalem because they knew the famine was going to hit their hardest. Because they asked a simple question: how can we help? And so Paul saw all of this happen. He watched it. If you fast forward 3 more years to AD 49, Paul, like I said, was a guy that used to persecute Christians, but now he's starting churches. And in one of the cities he started a church was called Galatia. And this little church in Galatia was beginning to face some trouble. They were beginning to get a little persecution. They were beginning to have some uncertainty and some unrest. And they were looking at their future, and they began to ask questions about what's going to happen, what is happening, are we going to be safe? What is God doing? And they began to be concerned. And Paul wrote him a letter. He wrote him a letter, and he wrote it out of what he had seen happen in the past. And so if you've got a Bible, we're going to be in Galatians chapter 6, verse 7. And in Galatians 6, Paul takes some time and he says, listen, here's what I've seen happen before. And here's how you can apply it to what's happening to you today. And it can actually change your future. And so let's look at that together. Galatians chapter 6, verse 7. Paul gives them what I call the rule of do. Now, the rule of do is actually something that applies to all of us, even if you don't think it does. It does apply to you. It's not karma. It's not some kind of cosmic force. This is just the way God set the world up. All right, so let's read about that. Verse 7 says, do not be deceived. God cannot be mocked. A man reaps what he sows. Whoever sows to please their flesh from the flesh will reap destruction. Whoever sows to please the Spirit from the Spirit will reap eternal life. I'll just stop right there for a minute, because you might be thinking, wait a minute, I missed the rule. Where do they talk about the rule of do? The rule of do is very, very simple. What you do now shows up later, right? And we know this. I mean, you can take any aspect of your life, and this is true. What we do now shows up later. So apply it for just a moment to work and school. So for example, you know this, the effort level, the work ethic you have when it comes to school shows up in your grade. Right? The work ethic, the effort you put into your job shows up in how your career goes. We know this. What you do now shows up later, right? That makes sense. It works in relationships. And if you happen to be married, you know this. How you love your spouse right now determines what kind of marriage you're going to have later. I mean, it's obvious. It's always true. It works when you talk about sports or you talk about your work. How you practice determines how you play, right? Whether you're getting ready for a soccer game or a sales presentation, if you practice well, you tend to perform well. It even works in the financial world. How you handle your money today determines if you'll have any money to handle tomorrow, right? We get this. This is the rule of do. Whatever it is that you do now, it shows up later. And Paul is telling this little church in Galatia, and I think he's telling us too, what you do now matters. It matters a lot. What you do now when the future's uncertain, what you do now when you're not sure, what you do now when things look a little dark or a little uncomfortable, it matters a lot because it's going to show up later. And Paul would even say it matters even more from a spiritual standpoint. Yeah, it matters from money and relationships and work and all those things, but it matters from a spiritual standpoint. And let me see if I can give you an example of this. And I hope the first one is kind of negative, so I hope this doesn't sound familiar, okay? I hope this doesn't sound like you or anyone you know, but it illustrates the point. So if from a standpoint of a spiritual person, what you do now, what you sow, if what you do now is you tend to refuse forgiveness to people, if you hold grudges, if you go to places you shouldn't be, if you get online and click on things you shouldn't see, if you're a demanding person, if you're a person that insists on your rights and getting things the way you want them and having everything set up the way you want it to be, if that's what you do, if that's what you sow, here's what you harvest. Here's what comes later. You end up being low-key angry all the time. You have a lot of anxiety and you feel like people are against you and it's everybody else. You tend to become a very divisive person. You tend to be a judgmental and critical person. You're the kind of person that celebrates other people's failures. And what happens is if you do that and you begin to harvest this, your life gets smaller and darker and smaller and darker. Because what you do now shows up later. And hopefully, like I said, that doesn't sound familiar to you at all. Because the opposite is true too. The opposite is true, that what you do now spiritually shows up later. So now, if you are the kind of person that extends forgiveness, that shows compassion, that has mercy, that puts yourself second and lets somebody else go first. It's not about my rights, it's about you. If you go around asking the simple question, how can I help? And you determine to be a generous person, if that's what you do now, that shows up later too. And the way it shows up is people see you, people experience you as a patient person, a kind person, gentle, a good leader, a loving and thoughtful person to be around, somebody who is rich in their relationships, somebody who is an encourager, somebody who has a gift to give to people instead of a demand to make from somebody else. And your life, it keeps getting bigger and brighter and bigger and brighter. You see, what you do now, it shows up later, especially when it comes to spiritual things. And so Paul is telling these Galatians, look, you're not sure about your future. Look, you're looking out there and you're wondering. Let me tell you, if you will simply ask the question, how can we help? And you will make the decision to do the right things now, there's going to be a harvest later. I mean, of course, if it works financially and it works in relationships and it works in your job, it's going to especially work in your spiritual life and the impact you have on other people. He tells them, if you will take what you've learned from the past and this rule of do and put them into motion, your future will look a lot different. Look at Galatians chapter 6, verse 9. He says it this way, let us not become weary in doing good, for at the proper time we will reap a harvest if we do not give up. Therefore, as we have opportunity, let us do good to all people, especially to those who belong to the family of believers. Paul's telling him, because of what we learned from the past, because of this sowing and reaping, what you do shows up later, because we know all these things. Even though the future's dark, even though you're uncertain, maybe you feel a little scared, maybe you feel a little bit uncomfortable with what's coming, maybe you have some anxiety around it. He's telling them, listen, if you will make the decision that in the face of struggle, do not give in to envy, instead do good, you can count on God bringing a great harvest. If you will make the decision to do good, not to demand, not to insist, not to shout down, but to do good in the face of evil, God's going to bring a harvest. It reminds me of a guy I used to live next to. And this was almost 20 years ago, and Don and I lived in Tucson, and we moved in kind of a newer housing subdivision, and so everybody in there was doing the same things, right? Trying to get their house ready, and they had moved in, and everybody's trying to get their house set up and all this stuff, and it was a new house for us, and we had a neighbor that lived across the street. His name was Steve, and Steve had, I would say, about 3 or 4 years on us. So Steve and his wife were 3 or 4 years older than we were. They had a son. He was about 3 or 4 years older than our daughter, but Steve had just moved into his first house too, and so we would see each other, coming home. We'd get home about the same time and wave, and got to know Steve a little bit, and then Steve and I would occasionally help each other with yard projects and things like that, simple stuff, nothing too serious, but hey, can you help me move this, or can you help me stack that, whatever, and we got to know each other and kind of became friends, and we barbecued with them one time. I believe they had us over, and so we kind of had this relationship, and I knew from the past, and I knew this rule of do, and so I thought, okay, I know what I'm supposed to do. I am supposed to be Steve's friend and Steve's neighbor and love him, but I also want to tell him about Jesus, because I want to do just like these guys did, take the gospel with you and ask, how can we help? And so I want to take the gospel with me, and I began to try to share with Steve. And I tried to have a couple spiritual conversations with Steve while we were working on things or doing something, and Steve wasn't interested much at all. And then I thought, okay, well, maybe that's not the right track, and I'll invite him to some things. And I invited him to church a few times, and he wasn't interested in that. And then I thought, well, maybe like the big stuff. I'll invite him to Christmas Eve and Easter, and he's got a little boy, and maybe he'd like him to go to Vacation Bible School. And Steve wasn't even trying to be polite, like, hey, yeah, I'll think about it, or maybe so, or whatever. I would invite Steve, and he'd go, no, just no, not going. Okay. I thought, well, I don't know what else to do, and I'm still Steve's friend. We still wave, we still hang out, we're still doing our stuff. But Steve's not interested at all. Eventually, Don and I moved, and we were talking. I was talking to Steve before we moved out, and he's like, hey, I saw you guys are getting the moving truck. What's going on? We were talking, and he's like, oh, I hate to hear that. I hate that you guys are leaving. I said, yeah, I wish you'd come with us, and we moved. And to be honest, I kind of forgot about Steve. I mean, time went on, we moved, we set up a new house, new job, trying to get kids in school, doing all the stuff we're doing, And I guess it was about 9 months after I had moved. I got an email from a guy at the church in Tucson that I was at and had been serving at. And the email, he just said, hey, I don't know if you remember your neighbor Steve, ? And of course, it's an email, so it's not a conversation. And he says, I just want to let you know, he's been coming to church. He and his family have been coming to our church for the last 3 or 4 weeks. And I thought, oh, that was pretty cool. And as I keep reading the email, and he says, and he wanted me to tell you that he's getting baptized this Sunday. And I was like, you got to be kidding me. That was so cool. And I don't tell you that story because, hey, look what Pastor Brett did. I tell you that story because this is what God does. When we are willing to do what we're supposed to do now, God brings a harvest later. It may be different than we expect. It may not look like what we thought. It may not be on our terms and our situation the way we would have done it. But that's what God does. When we do the right things now, God brings a harvest later. And it shows up. And so as a church, we have entered into this time called Global Impact. And if you've been around Mountain Ridge, you've heard of that. If you haven't, that's okay. I can explain it very, very quickly. Global Impact is an emphasis that we have every year, but it actually shows up every week in what we do. And it's how we put a focus on doing those two things of taking the gospel with us and asking the question, how can we help? And we talk about it as something we pray about, and we do. We pray for that. We do that work. We go places when we have opportunity, and we give to make those things happen. That's what global impact is. How do we have an impact on our neighbors here in Phoenix? How do we have an impact on our region and across Arizona and even into Mexico? And then how do we have an impact across the world? Because we can take the gospel with us and we can show up anywhere and ask the question, how can we help? And so that's what global impact is. And so if you've been around, you've begun to hear about some of these partners and some of the things that we do. And so let me give you an example of how the rule of do works with global impact. You see, Mountain Ridge High School is our neighbor as a church. And so every time we approach Mountain Ridge High School and ask them, hey, how can we help? We're sowing. And every time we partner with New Life Pregnancy Center and we ask them, hey, how can we help? Can we send volunteers? Can we send bags? Can we connect with you? Can we help somehow? Every time we get a chance to connect with the New Life Pregnancy Center and help families who are trying to figure out what to do with this pregnancy, we're sowing. Every time we go to Haiti, every time we connect with our partners in Haiti or send shoeboxes to Haiti or help with the mechanic school that we're building in Haiti, in essence, what we're doing is we're asking the question, how can we help? And we're sowing. And every time we get an opportunity to connect with one of our partners like this, with one of the churches that we've planted, and we say, hey, how can we help? We're sowing. Now, this year was crazy different, right? I mean, it didn't work out like most years work out. The trips we had planned didn't happen. The events we were going to hold, we didn't do. The drives and some of the emphasis and things that we were really hoping and praying that we'd have an opportunity to make an impact, they weren't even possible because of what's going on around us. But here's why I'm so excited about our church. We didn't stop. We couldn't meet in our building the same way we used to. We've got an international pandemic going on, and we didn't stop asking the question, how can we help? We just changed how we did it. And so one of the things we did to sow this year was we decided to, hey, we've got teachers that are getting ready to go back to school that are going to have to teach remotely, and some of them have never done it before. How can we help? And we created teacher bags, and we gave them, if nothing else, we gave them a free dinner and a bunch of supplies to say, hey, we love you, we care about you, and we're with you, we're for you. We also realized a lot of our families, their kids are going back to school and they're doing online school and they're just not set up for this and they're not thinking this way. And so we did the same thing. We created bags for families that said, hey, you know what? We want you to have this to help you get ready for a different kind of school year because we're for you. We hosted blood drives where we were able to help several hundred people in our community because we're for the people in our community. And the blood officials had reached out to us and said, hey, can you help? And we said, yes, we absolutely can. We are for our community. We had church plants that had no place to meet and they had no ability to record their services, and we recorded it for them and sent it out for them because we're for them and we're sowing. You see, I don't know what the harvest is going to look like. I don't know what God's going to do as a result of all of that. But I do know as a church that I am glad to be in this with you, where when we are faced with evil or uncertainty or difficulty, our response is to say, no, we are going to do good. We're going to take the gospel with us. We're going to ask the question, how can we help? That's who we are. That's who Mountain Ridge is. It reminds me of a story. A guy named Austin had some friends. He lives in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. And Austin's friends decided to prank him. So they put his number up on Craigslist and said, free turkeys, call now. And so if you've never done anything on Craigslist, it takes about that long for your stuff to get around. And Austin got about 100 phone calls in the first 2 days for free turkeys. And he had no idea because he didn't place the ad. His friends placed it for him as a joke. And as they talked about it, Austin and his 3 friends, they said, I can't believe there's that many people out there that were calling to try to get free turkeys. Yeah, I know, isn't that odd? And it kind of hit them. The reason they're calling for free turkeys is because they're in trouble. And so Austin and his friends decided to do something about it. And they began to raise some money. It was just 4 of them. They weren't able to raise a ton. They raised $1,400. And they took that money and they talked to the grocery stores and they talked to some of the people around them and they made that $1,400 go as far as they possibly could. And they were able to provide meals for about 80 families this first Thanksgiving that they did this. And it was so successful and so impactful to them that they decided to start something called Operation Give Bird, which I'm a little worried about the title. You giving people the bird, or what are you doing? Yeah. And now in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, these 4 guys help provide Thanksgiving meals for families every year because they want to make sure that they can have Thanksgiving. And when I read that, I got to be honest with you, the first thing I thought of, that's Mountain Ridge Church. That is Mountain Ridge Church. That's the kind of things that Mountain Ridge Church does. You see, that's why we do Global Impact, because we want to make a difference. And don't get me wrong, this is not doing good for the sake of doing good. No, we take the gospel with us. We let them know who Jesus is and why we're doing this, and we invite them to follow Jesus with us. And we also recognize that there's people in our lives, there's neighbors, there's friends, there's coworkers that have needs, and we want to go to them and ask the question, how can we help? How can we meet that need? What can we do? And that's exactly what Global Impact is. And so today I want to invite you to take a step and to be part of Global Impact. Now, like I said earlier, Global Impact is kind of set into 3 different areas. And so we talk about what we can be praying for, and we will notify you and let you know and communicate all throughout the year different ways you can be praying about our community, about this region, and about our world. And we will go. Things will change eventually, sooner or later. I mean, we already are going to our neighbors, but eventually we're going to have opportunities to go beyond even our city and go into different places because we want to take the gospel with us and we want to meet needs. And so when we have opportunities to go, we'll tell you. It may be building a house just over here in Northwest Glendale with Habitat for Humanity. It may be on a trip to Haiti. I don't know. But wherever we have opportunities to go, we will go. But today we're talking about give. And today what we do and what I want to invite you to do is to consider what your role would be. And the way we do that is through what we call a faith promise card. Now, a faith promise card, you don't have to put any money down right now. That's not what we're saying. What we're saying is that in faith, if God gives me the means, if God gives me the resources in 2021, I want to give this much to the Global Impact emphasis because I want to be part of that solution. I want to be that person that takes the gospel with them and shows up and says, how can we help? Now, if you have your phone, take your phone out real quick. If you've got a phone with you, take your phone out. As a matter of fact, if you've got the church app on it, you may already have a notification because we tried to make this super simple for you today. So on your phone, if you've got a notification from the church app, if you punch that notification, it will take you to your faith promise card. If you don't have it, you can simply go to mountainridge.org/missions. And when you go there, you're going to see something very basic. It's just going to say, click here. And you click on it, it will take you to the faith promise card. It's very simple information. It's your name, your information, and what you feel like you could do. For some of you, you may just say, hey, I want to do a one-time gift. I want to help. Some of you may feel like, no, I want to do something every week or every month or whatever makes sense. And I'll be honest with you, we're asking you to do this above and beyond. I mean, we take an offering, and that offering is what allows us to operate as a church. Global Impact is us, like this Antioch church, saying, hey, we heard there's a need, and we're willing to sacrifice. We're not asking what are we going to get and how come we don't have and we need and we want. Instead, we're saying, how can we help? How can we have an impact? And so you've got that there on your phone, and I just want to encourage you, if you're ready to do it today, fill it out today. If not, if you need some time, just keep the link open on your phone, and when you are ready, fill it in. And for many of you, you've been given Global Impact already. You've done it for years, and thank you for doing that. That's why we are able to do so many of the things we're able to do. But I would ask you to fill it out one more time, because it helps us plan. It helps us understand what kind of resources we're going to have to work with as we jump into 2021. And so fill that out as your next step today. And really what you're doing is you're saying, you know what? I am going to learn from the past. I believe in this rule of do, that what I do now, God is going to do something great with it later. And so that brings me to the place where I am willing to say, you know what? I'm going to take the gospel with me and I'm going to ask the question, how can I help? global impact is the perfect way to do that. Let's pray together.